we're going to focus specifically on the book of Job, just because of its interest, its character, its uniqueness. In the previous session, we started talking about wisdom literature, and these are the books that consist of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the book of Job. And what we have seen in the wisdom literature is that book of Proverbs, for example, addresses the world or speaks of the world in its rhythms and in its order. And in many ways, there is a very commonsensical kind of thread and theme that runs through Proverbs. If you do something this way, then you can expect this. And a lot of it is not earth-shattering in that way. It just kind of reveals to us that this is the way the world is structured. This is the way things are put together. This is the order of things. And when you find these rhythms, you can find things like fulfillment and purpose in life. If Proverbs was all we had, then it would be a fairly simple story. However, wisdom has another side to it. It is not just about the order and rhythms that are present in life and that God has placed into our world. There is also the reality that life doesn't always go according to the plan. Life does not always seem to coincide and correlate with the rhythms, and it is not always the case, as anyone could experience, and as we all do experience, that if we do this, then the result will be this certain outcome. There are things that just seem to go against the very way that the world and creation is put together. So while a book like Proverbs says this is the way the world is ordered, books like Ecclesiastes and the book that we'll be talking about today, the book of Job, says, hold on. We believe that there is this order, and we know that God has created this, and that there is rhyme and reason and rhythm and those kinds of things. However, our experiences, or in Job's case, his particular experience is going to lead him to question the way that he understood the world and the way that he did conceive of God's order and structure of the world. So let's just kind of give it a look here and see if we can kind of get our hands and minds around what the book of Job is all about. It's really hard not to get interested in the book of Job because of its sheer storyline. Who could ever read words like, in the land of Uz, there was a man whose name was Job? Opening line. Well, most of us are probably hooked right there. And then we get the kind of the description of Job, that he was a righteous man and everything that he did, life is going well. God is blessing. He has wealth. He has a beautiful family. He honors God. You could not have asked for a more righteous man. As a matter of fact, God himself even noted that Job was the righteous man on the earth. And so a story begins. Part of the thing that makes the story so powerfully relevant to any generation is not only just the experience of it and the truthfulness of it, the way it connects to anybody at any time in life, but the biblical writer also kind kind of just did not place the story in cleanly and clearly in a historical context like we have many stories, probably for this very purpose. It is the kind of story that just spans through time. And so there are some fairly undefined features of this story, but emerging from all of the things that we don't know about the story. When exactly did all of this happen? Where exactly did all of this happen? Things that we often know about other events or other books in the Bible. This story has a feature about it that just exceeds those kinds of limits and boundaries of things like time and place and geography. And so we have the story of Job. And as we've noted, Job is a very righteous man. But what Job does not know is that while he is just living his life and doing what he is doing, there is outside of his view and outside of his vision, a conversation, an exchange that goes on in heaven. And the person that is in the middle of this exchange with God is the one who is the adversary, often translated in our Bibles as the Satan, something of a prosecutor type figure. This is almost like a court scene. So when you're reading the book of Job, very necessary to understand some of the dynamic that is happening in this court scene. Many of us probably had an assumption, especially if you are familiar with the book of Job, that the Satan or the adversary came into the presence of God and said something like, I was roaming about through the earth and I found Job, and I think we need to put him to the test. That is not all the way it unfolded. God himself is the one who, in the conversation, said to the accuser, to the adversary, to the Satan, "Have you considered Job?" And God kind of pointed him in Job's direction and mentioned to him the righteousness in which he lived, and the Satan's response to that was, well, I see that indeed he's the most righteous man in all the earth. However, there is a caveat here, possibly. He is only righteous because of the way that you have blessed him. And look at his home, look at his family, look at his bank account, look at his life. Of course he's righteous. You've blessed him. But if, in a sense, your hand were to turn against him, or if your blessing were to be removed from him, do you really think that he would still be righteous just for the sake of being righteous? And God kind of accepted the challenge and said, all right, you have permission to go up against Job, and you can do whatever you wish, but you can't touch him. So the Satan goes, and ultimately stories end up where he loses his cattle, he loses his family, and even his wife kind of takes up the position of the accuser, and Job maintains his righteousness and he maintains his integrity in all of this. And so the Satan goes back to the presence of God. And in this particular exchange, he is granted the ability to touch Job but not kill him. And so as a result of all of that, Job just breaks out in sores from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. He is in inexplicable misery and pain. He is cast outside. At this point in time, all has been lost. And it is at this point, and all of this happens in the first 2 chapters of this story setup. And what happens in the next chapters, nearly 40 of them, before the finale or the epilogue in chapter 42, there is a lot of dialogue, and actually much of it is monologue. And Job's friends hear about this, and 3 guys, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, show up. And here's what basically is going to drive what is going to be said next, and what is going to be the kind of the context and the content of the conversation that they are going to have with Job. There was a conventional wisdom perspective that went like this: if you obey God, He will bless you. If you disobey God, He will curse you. Now, that conventional wisdom idea was very pervasive in their world and in their culture. But it did not stop with that, because that in itself, would be something that certainly we could say that certainly is the case. That there is something about obedience that leads to God's blessing, and something about disobedience that leads to cursing. But when you flip that around and look at it backwards, in other words, if you see somebody, or there's a situation in which we see that, as we describe it and as we define it, we see the blessing of God, then we make the conclusion, running back the other way, that they must be blessed of God because of their obedience. That's the only way that their life could be in such a state of blessing. They are obedient to God. The crux really comes in Job's story right here. The thing that really gets wrapped around the axle in this is when you see somebody like Job, who is apparently cursed, there would be only one conclusion that you can make in their particular understanding of wisdom and in the way that God works in the world. The only conclusion that could be drawn from the miserable fate that has happened to Job is that he has disobeyed God. There just simply cannot be any other explanation in all of the world. The problem is that Job has maintained his integrity. He has maintained his righteousness, and for his friends to come to him and to look at what has happened to him, and what has happened to Job is such a desperate sight that, as the story is told, when his friends show up, they just sat there for an entire week and kind of looked at each other without anybody saying a word, until finally Job started speaking about this. But the question that emerges in this part of the wisdom literature is certainly one of the most, if not the most pervasive question of biblical, not just wisdom, but the entire biblical story. And it is a question that could be stated something like this: how would a good and powerful God allow suffering to come to good people like Job? Or why does suffering come? And how do you kind of get your heart and mind wrapped around that? How do we have a world which God created and we see the rhythms of order and the beauty of all of those things? Also, be the same world in which there is an apparent sense of lack of justice. How do we, in one sense, how do we understand if God is just and how God is just and how that justice is revealed in a world in which there is such a degree of brokenness and suffering? And obviously this story could not have been set up better. How is it possible to take the most righteous man in all of the world and come to some understanding of what has happened to him and how he could move from being so blessed to being so cursed, and have in all of that, at least from Job's perspective, maintain his sense of integrity, and he never comes off of anything but maintaining his righteousness in this entire story. So, the middle parts, a great chunk of the middle parts, from about chapter 3 all the way to to chapter 27, there's going to be a lot of dialogue between these three friends of Job. They're going to say something and Job is going to respond, then then the next individual speak and Job is going to respond. And in fact, they go through 3 cycles of this. Just a couple of interesting things you might want to notice along the way, that after the first cycle, where each of them, Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar, speak, Job responds. It appears that every time another cycle comes around, that what they have gets a little shorter. What Job has to say gets a little longer. And finally, by the time that you get to the third cycle, and Eliphaz comes back around and Bildad, by the time you get to Zophar, Zophar doesn't even speak. So it's pretty much suggestive of the fact that everything has been said about this issue. The whole idea that there's only one explanation for Job's state is that he has been disobedient, or that he has lived or committed some kind of sin, is brought before Job as the only explanation from his friends. This is the way that God acts. This is how God works in the world. This is the way God has set it up. And it was inconceivable that there could be any other explanation than just that. And against all of that, Job is wrestling. Job, the suffering that he has physically, I don't know. Perhaps it is only equaled by the suffering that he has within him. Why isn't God being just? For even if my friends don't believe, God knows that I am a righteous man. God knows that I'm a person of integrity. God knows that I haven't changed in all of this. Why is it that somehow this life of cursing has come to me when I have maintained who I am? And why isn't God rectifying this thing? Where is the justice in all of this? So, as you know, suffering always brings the toughest questions. And we see some of that. You can feel some of that here. Where is God when times of suffering come? How do you explain it? How do you understand it? What wisdom is there that might help us to endure or weather the suffering that we are up against? So, all of these things begin to swirl around in the middle of the book of Job, and the deep, heartfelt questions arise. And Job's friends simply cannot be convinced that Job has maintained his integrity and his righteousness. There's just no way to reconcile that with their understanding of the way that righteousness, or the way of their understanding of God's justice and his retribution, and how things like obedience and disobedience and blessing and cursing work in the world. There's just no way to look at Job and reconcile him to a story which suggests that Job has been innocent or that Job has been obedient. Job, knowing full well that he has been innocent and he has been obedient. So you can see how the winds and the cross currents of all of this are just going to lead to an incredible, just nearly theologically explosive kind of experience. After Job's friends have had their say at it, and nothing really has been decided, no answers come forth, the needle hasn't been moved in any way. The author of the book itself, in chapter 28, it's not Job speaking, not the friend speaking, just the author of the book of Job just has a chapter saying, where in fact does wisdom come from? And then after that, it comes down to Job and now his questioning. There will be another young man who will enter the story, and after Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar have had their say, this younger man, Elihu, will come, and the truth of the matter is he will give articulation to what the three former friends have said, but he will, in all honesty, he will carry it just another step forward, and it seems to be perhaps a step forward in the right direction, or at least a step beyond that which had been happening in the dialogue previously. He will suggest that perhaps the suffering is because of some disciplinary kind of thing, or God is doing something to prepare for the future. But he does open up the theological dialogue just a little wider than the ones who came before us. So Elihu kind of gives his version of all of this. Job and God kind of come to it, and Job gives all of his version of this. And what is interesting as you're reading, and what could be very helpful to your reading of this, a couple of things. One is to realize that all of the chapters after the prologue and before the epilogue, from 3 to 40, 41, all of those chapters are written in poetic ways. So you're reading along. Just remember that you're reading poetry. Also realize that before the finale here, where God breaks into the conversation, that God has not said a word. Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, Elihu, they have all shared what they have wanted to say to Job. In a sense, they have tried to be great defenders of God. This is wisdom as they understood it, and God had not said a word. And then at the end, finally, about chapter 38 or so, God speaks. And when he does so, you can almost hear the sound of his voice reverberating throughout the entire universe. For he, in this moment, is going to set things straight. He's going to offer a perspective that no one up to now had considered. None of the three friends, not Elihu, that Job himself had not considered. And what God is going to do, one of the features of it, he's going to ask a series of questions to Job. They're rhetorical questions. Like, where were you when I created all of this? Where does the rain come from? Where do the winds come from? Where do the waters of the oceans come from? Who made the rivers and the streams and the birds of the air? And how do mountain goats give birth? I mean, God is just going to dance all over creation. And it's almost as if he's going to take Job on a tour through all that he's created, from the stars to the depths of the oceans, and say, Job, what did you do to help make this happen? How did you participate in these creative acts? Do you know about this? Do you know how certain things work? Do you know how these animals, and you can almost, can you not, just feel Job and hear Job saying to himself, you know, I don't know this stuff. I'm not ever trying to say, I never tried to, cut in on you, and I never thought I was creator. I never thought I could answer all these kind of questions. I'm not saying I know all of this stuff. But what God is doing is, by the number of questions that are being posed to Job and this travel throughout the universe kind of thing, what God is doing is reframing the issue. Typically, this is what happens in times of suffering. This is just a human thing that happens to all of us. In times of suffering, our worldview just narrows. When we are the ones that are suffering, everything just comes down to us. And what Job needed was an experience and an encounter that just opened him up to the much larger picture of the world, of its creation. And as God is taking Job through all of this, what is probably the most interesting and the most revealing thing about all of this is that at the end of it, there is no answer. It is not as if God says, Job, you weathered all of this, you've been through all of this, this has been quite a story, I got to hand it to you. I lit the adversary, I unleashed him on you, and I know you've lost your wealth, I know you've lost your family, I know you've lost your reputation, I know you've lost your meaning for living and your purpose in life, and I tell you what, I just got to hand it to you. Here's the answer. God never did that. There's not one line, there's not anything in the book of Job that just reveals the answer. And the reality is that really helps us. Although it might sound initially disappointing, it really helps us to understand the nature of wisdom. So let me just suggest a couple of things to you. The nature of wisdom just simply cannot be put into a formula. It is not mechanical. It is not mathematical. And you simply cannot reduce it to, if you obey, God will bless, and if you disobey, God will curse, and turn that around. And as you see places, individuals, which you would define, or what I would say, they are blessed, make the automatic assumption that they have been righteous. It might not be the case. And conversely, it might not be the case at all, that when we look at situations and we say, wow, there could only be one explanation for the apparent suffering, for the cursed kind of feel that we sense about their life. They must have sinned. There must be, if they're not willing to admit it, there's got to be some unconfessed sin. There's got to be some disobedience that accounts for all of this. The reality is, things are happening in life, and things do happen in God's creation. And things do happen in a creation where God is in control of everything. And He is the creator still, and He is engaged. Things happen that do not fit our basic formulas for how we think life should happen, or oftentimes how we understand or recognize or perceive the presence of God, or the justice of God, or what God is about or what God is doing in times of suffering in whatever ways they may come. At the end of the day, the story ends with Job being doubly blessed by God. He has more sons and daughters, and he has family back, and he lives for a number of years, and he lives in the fullness of his years. And the story ends with this incredible, beautiful framework, the outpouring of the inner life with life's biggest question. And what happens to Job basically comes through in the end, or something that really gives us a clue as to what his experience has been when he says, I had always heard of you, speaking of God, but now I see you. And that becomes something of a climatic moment in Job's experience. And it's not that Job has the answer. It is that Job now has an experience, or he has a relationship with God that is not quite exactly the same kind of experience or relationship that he had with God when the story started. So if you're looking for an answer to the most difficult issues and problems and questions that we typically face in our humanity, you won't find it by just looking at a chapter and a verse in the book of Job. What you will find will be much more beautiful than that, will be much more powerful than that, will be much more life-changing than that. You will find a perspective that reveals our human questioning and our frailty, and that takes us on a journey, just like Job, takes us on a journey through all that God has done and who he is. And once we are able to see things and experience things from a kind of journey that God takes us on, and even as he is asking us questions we might not have considered before, and yet we're short on answers or perhaps have none at all, it is in that journey, it is in that experience that we begin to see God and experience God in ways that we would not have been able to do so otherwise. So I trust that you will find that your own journey through the book of Job will allow you to have some space in your life where you can say, I can relate to this, and rather than thinking of something's wrong with Job, or he did something, or he's not coming clean, or his friends don't get it, or whatever, realize that this is a story that certainly is revealing of our own lives, of our own questions, of our own lack of understanding, of our own misperceived notions of perhaps of God's blessings or God's cursing, and the way that we frame that up in our culture, in our times, and how we talk about these kinds of things. And sometimes we just need for God to have a place in our life where, or we should have a place, I should say, in his life, where the questions, the big questions, are bigger than even the questions that we had thought were the big questions. Suffering is the big one. But when you put all of that stuff in light of who God is and what he has done and what is it that he is accomplishing, we don't get the answer to it, but we get the perspectives that can help us to move forward in our faith and to have happened to us what Job had happened to him, that we see God.